Hi everyone. In Module 6, we're going to have a look at various research designs, and in some cases we're looking at research projects using those methodologies. In this video, I'll take a quick look at some designs, and you'll also have a chance to look at the videos that are going to be produced by your colleagues and you that you'll be presenting on the forum in Module 6 around various methodologies that can be used in approaching research, various research questions. And it's always a great learning experience to have a look at other people's videos and the comments that your colleagues make about those videos in relation to their research topic and so on. So I'm looking forward to that, and I know that you will be as well. You'll learn a lot from that. In this course, we've discussed and in some cases actually experienced the steps in designing a research project. And those steps include identifying an issue, which you've already done. You'll be identifying a research problem, and in a way, you'll be also talking about the purpose of the research in Module 7. And then when you go on to your next course, you'll be developing your research question based on all of that thinking that you've been doing around those issues. Once all of that is decided, then you can go ahead and, of course, along the way, you'll be thinking about it as well. But you can make a final decision around your research approach, which includes your methodology and your methods. And then you will collect and analyze your data using various ways of doing that. You'll write up your findings, and then you'll share your findings in a whole range of ways. Among them could be presenting at teachers' conference. It could be a workshop for your colleagues at your own school, at other schools, at the district level, and so on. So there are a whole range of ways in which your findings can find their way into a professional journal, for example. So there are a range of ways in which you can share your findings so that they are effective in helping other people think about their practices and perhaps transform those practices in certain kinds of ways. And as the previous slides demonstrates, the tools, there are various steps in this process. What's important to remember here is that when we talk about qualitative or quantitative data, or research rather, we are focusing on the methods and leaving out a great deal more that informs our choice of methods, the area of inquiry that we begin with, the research paradigm in which we are operating, and the methodology that responds best to our area of inquiry. Then qualitative or quantitative or mixed methods. Lots of times I have students will say in a hearing for their dissertation or whatever, I did qualitative research or I did quantitative research. I think what we're saying here is that there's much more to it than that. What kind of qualitative research are you doing? What kind of quantitative research are you doing? In other words, what methodology and methods are you using? So for example, in my doctoral research, my question was around was around resistance to gender equity policy. The paradigm that I chose was qualitative. My methodology was critical feminist phenomenology. And my methods included things like interviews, data, document analysis, and focus groups. So I had a variety of methods that I used. And then the data collection tools that I needed were things like, well, I needed a tape recorder, for example, or I might have needed a video recorder. I didn't use a video recorder, but that's another way of doing it. I needed to be sure that I had a socket to plug it into because it wasn't a battery operated one, and so on and so forth. So what are the actual tools that you need? Computer that can do certain kinds of things, etc., etc. So that's your research design. These are the steps to your research design. So when you're thinking about your own research, then you're going to be thinking about these steps. But as I mentioned, they aren't going to necessarily be linear, because as you work your way through them, you may find that you need to return to a previous step and rethink it and rework it so that you can proceed and so on. So if your process turns out not to be completely linear, that's not unusual at all. Okay, so we're going to be talking specifically about, in this module, we're going to be, as a methodology, we're going to be talking about document analysis. And the reason that we have put it in here is because you'll be looking at all kinds of other ways of doing research. And we have talked off and on about different kinds of ways of doing research. But document analysis is not one that's often taken up, and yet it's one that is often used. So we felt that it was important for you to have a look at what we mean by document analysis and so on. So the three authors that we have chosen, as well as some other things that I'll talk about in a minute, are Glenn Bowen, who was one of the first really to pull together the information that had been gathered around document analysis and put it into some kind of cohesive form, so that when you read his article, you have an idea of what document analysis is and how you do it. Who are the authors that we need to be aware of in terms of doing this kind of work. Carol Cardno is one who has looked at a very specific kind of document analysis, and that is policy analysis. And then Ben Katsaruba at Queen's, and Lorraine Gooden, who was at Queen's at the time and is now at Carleton, and Leah Triguna, at Queen's, have put together a really interesting article using document analysis to look at the whole question of teacher attrition. So, so you've got the theory and the practice together, and I think it's a really interesting packet of readings that will stand you in good stead in thinking about document analysis and how this might fit into your own research practice. Creswell's video talks about mixed methods, and Zina O'Leary actually answers or thinks through the question, what's the best approach, qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods? And I think there's some really interesting information there. Now, the Zina O'Leary's video is not required, but I would strongly, strongly recommend it as something for you to have a look at for your own work now or in the future. I'm not going to discuss mixed methods in any detail, as there's a lot of information in Creswell and Guterman, and then Creswell's video does a good job of introducing its advantages. And I believe it's one of the presentations as well. O'Leary talks about those advantages and as well as the disadvantages too, and they do it in a very accessible way. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I do want to comment, however, that when people, I found that students really find mixed methods really appealing because it brings in both methodologies into one research project. And so it seems to have kind of a heightened degree of legitimacy for one thing. And it's a very useful approach. And so it's something that people are attracted to, and legitimately so. I want to warn, however, two things. First of all, because mixed methods uses two methodologies, it also takes twice as long. So when you're thinking about your own research project, you need to keep that in mind if you're thinking at all about mixed methods. And the second part of it is that you have to have very strong statistical skills in order to be able to do mixed methods. You have to be able to do it because it's your research project. You won't be able to hire somebody to do the analysis for you. In the case of this kind of research, you will need to have to be able to do it yourself. So I just put those two caveats out there. While you're thinking about mixed methods, it's a really wonderful approach. However, there are a couple of things that you need to be thinking about in terms of the timeline that you have available to you for your own research. So I just put that out there as a kind of caveat to be thinking about. Document analysis is a very useful approach to research. It can be used as a supplementary part of a research project, and it can also be a standalone method too. In my own research, for example, I've often examined policy statements, board minutes, and informal documents such as school handouts. Public records of the names of public officials are often helpful as well as newspapers, posters, and so on. I remember spending quite a long time in the down in the basement of the education faculty's library at Western, in a very musty corner with some old books that were put together by the Ontario government to name all of the different people who held different positions. And my goal was to find any women represented in the positions that were listed in those musty old volumes. And I was looking for directors of education and inspectors of education. And so those public records were very, very helpful, and they can, they're available in many places, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Realia can be useful too. So for example, when interviewing a participant in a large study of retired teachers in 20th century Ontario, one of the participants showed the person who was with me doing the research and I, a graduation diploma from her normal school with Egerton Ryerson's signature on it. Now, we were pretty excited at the time because Egerton Ryerson at that point, his legacy had not been critiqued to any degree at all. This was like well over, oh gosh, this would be like 30 years ago maybe or more. And he was seen as the father of public education, basically, because as he set it up in Ontario, that tended to be the model, and he modeled it on other places as well, too. That tended to be the model that was taken up in other provinces in Canada. Unfortunately, his legacy also was tainted by his involvement with residential schools and defending residential schools and so on. And so, so there's a whole other side to Egerton Ryerson that is being critiqued in this moment. But it was one of those moments that are kind of fun when you're doing document analysis. You come across something that you're just not expecting, a person that you've read about, their real signature or a picture of them doing something that you wouldn't expect them to be doing, or whatever. Others had kept documents that others of the teachers that we were interviewing had kept sentimental things that were really a lot of fun to look through, or documents that they had disagreed with and been part of, committees and resistance movements against various policies that have been implemented and so on. So it really adds to the context of the study and makes it something that lives in a whole different kind of way. So what I'm saying is that a document analysis can use many formal and informal kinds of documents as a source of data. There are many advantages and disadvantages to document analysis. First, one of the advantages is that it's cheap. A lot of this information is available on computer, in computer collections. It's available in libraries. It's available in old museums. You can sometimes gain access to some really interesting stuff. I remember one of my colleagues at Western, a historian, came across a box that nobody had even opened that had been contributed to a small museum in Alberta. And I couldn't even tell you the name of the museum. I wish I could, but I couldn't. And she was able to spend a good deal of time going through that box. And it turned out to be the last effects and, things that had been saved by a woman who had been very instrumental in developing curriculum and many of the practices around progressive education in Alberta way back in the 40s through to the 70s in Alberta education. And she was able to develop a whole timeline around that and do some historical research that brought to light somebody that had not been a part of the discussion of Alberta education at all. So, and I was able to use that reading in one of the courses that I taught on gender and educational leadership. So things like that are really interesting, and they're available usually for free, and you're just able to, if you have the credentials, to be able to look through them. They're available and easily available in these locations as well. The interesting thing is that they provide the exact information as it was recorded at the time. And so it could be like newspapers, for example. It could be official documents, et cetera, et cetera. but it becomes a document that provides a specific kind of information that then can be compared to other kinds of information for cross-reference purposes. It can often cover across time and contexts and events. So, for example, when I was looking at those volumes that had those names, I was able to look at different decades and see whether representation of women increased, where it increased, how it increased, and so on. And it ended up being, a very interesting kind of comparator that I was able to use. It also, document analysis also means that you're not working with human subjects. You're working with documents as they exist. So it means that you don't have to seek permission for working with human subjects, which depending on the kind of question you're asking and the time that you have, could be quite important. Some of the disadvantages are that it's not created specifically for research. So it may not be in a form that's easily translatable into research because it has insufficient detail, or it may be difficult to retrieve. It's an old document that's been photocopied and photocopied and photocopied, or taken off some kind of old technology, and the print may not be really readable, and so on. It may also include selective information based on the particular interests and beliefs of the note taker. And I'll give you an example. I was interviewing an Indigenous man who was a vice principal of a large high school in Ontario at the time. And he told me a story of being a very young man. I think he was not more than 15 or 16 years old. He was one of the people in the on the reserve who was able to type. So he could read, write, and type. And he had access to a typewriter. I guess he maybe used it for his school assignments or something, I don't know. But at any rate, so he was asked by the council to go to meetings with the Indian agent, who was the chair of those councils. And so he went and he took notes, as well as the Indian agent himself. And they were both sent to the Department of Indian Affairs, and often had very different stories and different ideas included in them. So if someone wished to, they would be able to have the information as the residents of that particular reserve wish them to be seen, or an edited version as the Indian agent would want to have been seen. So you can sometimes compare then notes that are taken by different people, and develop a more layered kind of look at something that was going on, that was recorded in documents. So, but it may still be difficult to build a complete picture, and that's something that's just the nature of documents. Why do we do document analysis? Well, it often enhances or corroborates or enriches research, as I've mentioned. It's particularly helpful in qualitative studies. It's not necessarily useful at all in quantitative studies, but it might be useful in mixed research, for example. It can be a standalone method, as well as the Kutsaruba article demonstrates. What is document analysis? Well, it provides contextual data. So it really enriches that context that is so important in qualitative analysis. It may lead to questions that need to be asked. Why were there two different versions, for example, of the same meeting? What are the differences between them? Whose voices were being heard and whose voices were not being heard? Those sorts of questions. It provides supplementary research data beyond, and so it can be corroborating, as already mentioned. So it can be beyond the interviews and that sort of thing. It's a means of tracking change and development, as I already mentioned, and it's useful in verifying findings or corroborating evidence. And in that sense, it's a very useful way of pulling things together. Policy analysis, and this comes out of Cardno's paper, which was exceptionally interesting to me because for one thing, I'm kind of a policy wonk, but at the time that I was doing policy document analysis, there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that spoke directly to how to approach this as a method of inquiry. Her paper is exceptionally helpful, as is Boland's, for that very reason. And I'm only going to touch lightly on her paper here, as it's an interesting and very accessible read, so I know you'll get a lot out of it on your own or in discussions with your colleagues, but just a few points to get started. So why policy analysis? Why the particularity of policy analysis? Well, first of all, it offers the ability to make sense of the value-based intent of policy. A critical analysis of a policy can give us all kinds of information about what is said, what isn't said, whose voice is heard, whose voice isn't heard, what was the historical context at the time, all of that sort of kind of analysis is so important, rather than just simply looking at a document and saying, yes, that's the way it is. Well, there's a whole story behind that policy. Policy comes out of a story itself. And so what is that story? A policy analysis also offers us the opportunity to see how resources are determined. So for example, in the current discussions around health policy, where, right across the country, there are issues around availability of medical help, the question then becomes, what are the resources that we need to be looking at? Is it money? Is it people? People and money, of course, are the same thing in a way in a policy environment, and so on and so forth. Who gets to decide the resources? And what are those resources attached to? All of those kinds of questions can be part of that analysis. It affects the layers of stakeholders. So as I said, policy is a story. And when you kind of pick away at it, you can do some analysis and some historical analysis as well. You can see the layers of stakeholders that have had a voice or some way of influencing the resulting policy that occurred. And it may provide a platform for change, because the analysis itself may call into question some aspect of the policy that needs to be rethought. And when that analysis becomes available to policymakers and those who are instrumental in policy making or in critiquing policy, then changes can occur. Policy exists at various levels of the organization. And when we're doing that analysis, we need to look at how is that policy taken up at those various levels? What happens? What's the effect at each of those levels? At the macro level, and in education, we can think of that as the province. The meso level, that could be the community, and the micro level could be the school itself. Policy is produced in the arena of politics and policy. Politics is who gets one, where, and how, and who decides. That's one way to think about politics. So that's the story that needs to be understood and critiqued. Analysis requires critical engagement with the context. What was the context that was there? Was that a sufficient context? Should there have been other players that should have been included in the policy discussion, and so on and so forth? The text itself, what does it say? What doesn't it say? What should it say? All of these sorts of things. And what are the consequences of this policy? Both those that are expected and those that are unexpected. You can look at this, for example, in the study of the performance appraisals of teachers. What kinds of effects does that have? Where did that come from? Whose values are represented in that appraisal, and whose are not, et cetera, et cetera. So, I could go on and on about this, as you well know. But these kinds of analyses can be really helpful in sorting through what it is that you're looking at in your own work. And so I think you'll find these readings very helpful. And I know that you'll find your colleagues' videos about the various research designs that they're going to be looking at very helpful as well. So I hope that this module is going to be something that's going to be helpful to you in your ongoing journey towards doing your own research. And if you have any questions as we go along in this module, I'll be more than happy to answer them. So take care.